So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's CID Speaker Series. My name is Sarah Luttrell, and I'm the Communications and Events Manager at the Center for International Development here at Harvard University. I look forward to today's discussion on creating impact at a global scale for development. The format for today's discussion is a 20 to 25-minute moderated discussion and around 20 minutes left for Q&A. But before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. During the Q&A session, you can submit your questions directly into the chat or by using the raise your hand function if you'd like to directly ask your questions. We're also recording today's session, and the video of this event will be available on CID's YouTube channel. I will also add links in the chat to sign up for our newsletter and social media channels so you can hear more about research and events at CID. Our next speaker series event is on Friday, October 29th, and that will be back at our normal time of 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And that event will be with Latanya Mapp-Fret, who is the president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women. She'll be discussing why feminist funding is crucial for development. So we hope that you will join us for that event. We also ask that you save the date for Wednesday, October 27th from 1 to 2:15 p.m. Eastern Time. We're hosting a panel on building resilient education systems with CID experts Fernando Ramirez and Michela Carolana and UNESCO Assistant Director General for Education, Stefania Giannini. And this discussion will be moderated by CID Director Asim Khwaja. And this is part of our Beyond COVID event and podcast series on lessons learned from the pandemic and how we can create better trajectories forward. Each month, we're focusing on a different theme and sharing insights from CID experts and leading development practitioners. So stay up to date on CID's COVID page, which is on our website, and we hope to see you on October 27th. But without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce our moderator for today, Brian Trelstad. Brian is a senior lecturer of business administration at Harvard Business School and a CID faculty affiliate. His teaching and research focuses on social entrepreneurship, systems change, impact investing, and the role of business in society. So thank you all for being here today. And Brian, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here. And I'm thrilled to have an opportunity to speak with my good friend and longtime colleague, Andrew Stern. In full disclosure, I think since this was scheduled, I was actually invited to join the board of Andrew's organization, the Global Development Incubator. And so I am coming to you full of conflict of interest, but also with deep interest in the work that Andrew has done since his time as a student at the Kennedy School and Harvard Business School. And so, Andrew, I'd love to just start with that. You graduated from the dual degree program in 2003, and then you were part of an organization called the Dahlberg Group, which led you into kind of global development consulting. So tell us kind of your journey from Cambridge into Dahlberg, and then we'll pick up the story of what you learned from there. But help us understand what you did right out of school and getting you to Dahlberg.
Great. Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Sarah, for the opportunity to share some perspectives here. And Brian, I didn't just invite you to the board so you'd ask me easy questions, but right. hopefully that will help. So I finished up in 2003. I had been in management consulting before. I did a short detour back to straight management consulting, and then joined a handful of people, some other Kennedy School alumni, to help build up this organization called Dahlberg. And Brian, I think you'll remember in the early 2000s, there was a lot of energy around, could we bring more private sector skill sets, more private sector thinking, entrepreneurship, all of that into this field of international development. Acumen, Dahlberg, Skoll, Omidyar are a lot of the groups that I think are leaders in this field now. Were all started around that time. And that was my own personal interest. I had done degrees at the business school and the Kennedy School, very much with this idea of how to marry the two, how to bring some of the thinking into fields that may not have had as much exposure. And I'd say, like anything where you're trying to bring in some new thinking, one, the thinking's already there in some respects. And then two, to get it further, was often a challenge. I think a lot of times we showed up and it was sort of, why are you bringing these strategic frameworks? What are you trying to do here? But as you know, and maybe some of the people in the organization, this area has now grown pretty expansively. And Dahlberg, who I joined when I think it was 5 people, left when it was around 200 people, I think is probably now 500-600 people, and working, across the field with some of the largest organizations, whether it's governments or corporations or UN agencies. So for me, it was a great experience, great exposure, learned a lot, got to do some really interesting projects. I will just say one project, which when people ask me, out of the 10 years and 100 of them that I did, that I'd say I look back and think may have had the highest impact, was actually a partnership with Harvard CID, with Professor Ricardo Hausman, with Marcela Escobari, and that was developing the economic vision and roadmap for Guatemala around 2010 or 11. And I'd say, and this may be a theme throughout this discussion, while I think we did some really interesting technical work, and those of you who know Professor Hausman, some of the thinking around the product space analysis and laid out this amazing roadmap, I think the highest impact came because we did a big leadership effort that we brought in some moderators from the Aspen Institute to bring together about 20 people from across the Guatemalan society that would never speak, environmentalist, indigenous people's representative, business person, politician, and put them through a year of working together in economic planning to ultimately carry this vision and roadmap forward. So good experience, but that one in particular, with a tie back to the Kennedy School, I think was probably the highest impact one I had.
Yeah, well, I'm going to pick up on that. And I mean, one of the, I think, lessons we've learned that's been a limitation to kind of straight business thinking as applied to any sector, social entrepreneurship or international development, has been an overemphasis on the unit of analysis being the firm. And how do you make the firm bigger, better, more able to do the work? And you hinted at with the Guatemalan story of really what made a difference was the collaboration. So can you talk a little bit about how some of the observations of the limit to scaling a solution led you to realize that solving problems at scale may involve thinking extra organizationally and across system actors, which I understand is really kind of the heart of what the Global Development Incubator does. So how did you kind of arrive at the work that the Global Development Incubator does now through your work?
Yeah. So, after 10 years of advising other people to do good in the world, I wanted to step in the ring, so to speak, myself, and try to make myself a little more accountable for the work I was doing, and candidly to sort of energize myself a bit. And I'd say 3 sort of areas of experience came together, which helped form my thinking around the Global Development Incubator. So one, I'd helped start up and then chair for about a dozen years a successful social enterprise called Mothers to Mothers, focused on preventing a mother-to-child transmission of HIV, and had realized that in the decades since Skoll and others had been championing social enterprise, there were very few organizations, Mothers to Mothers maybe being one of the few, that had really achieved a scale commensurate with the size of the problem they were trying to solve. So despite the hundreds of organizations, conversations, very few had scaled. So that was one sort of piece of it. I was trying to think through, how do we think less about scale of organization and more about scale of impact? So that was one piece. A second piece was, while I was at Dahlberg, some of the most important work I think I had done, and Brian, that's how you and I met, was helping to set up some of what I think of now as these multi-stakeholder initiatives, which is, how do you bring together public, private, philanthropic sectors to sort of rethink and establish a field and do all the work that needs to be done to build that field. And one of the things Brian and I worked on together was launching the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, Andy, at the Aspen Institute, focused on propelling small and growing businesses as a means for poverty alleviation and economic growth around the world. and a recognition that that type of model could be used elsewhere, right? So bringing together different actors into a field. And then the third, I had spent a lot of time in Dahlberg's private equity practice, advising on fund structuring, quite a bit around impact investing. And I think when we talk about the big problems we all want to solve, you need to bring capital together from a variety of sources, because no one type of capital has the right size nor the right incentives to really be able to do that. So with those three pieces, it was sort of like, how do I build something that can help social enterprises scale their impact, bring together a variety of partners, and maybe look at some of the financing platforms as well. And while I think consulting is an amazing tool for established organizations, for early stage startup organizations, it's often not the right tool. They need strategy, but as many people on this call know, when you start an effort, you need recruiting and legal and finance and operations and marketing. And I wanted to create a model where you could bring all of those together. So that was sort of the genesis of GDI.
So one of the earlier organizations that has gained fairly significant scale has been Aceli Africa, that was sort of launched by somebody who'd been at Root Capital. Root Capital was a founding member of Andy. So tell us, so what did you do with Brian Milder and Aceli? How did you bring together this kind of multi-stakeholder and kind of smart capital approaches, and how did you help de-risk instead of consulting, but incubating in sort of in another word of what you said? So just share with us that story and where Aceli is today.
Yeah. So as Brian said, this grew out of some conversations with Root Capital, where Brian was a vice president there, and an effort we had helped him set up called the Council on Smallholder Agricultural Finance, CSAF, and it was meant to be, for those of you who are familiar with the microfinance field, sort of an analog to CGAP. Could we build the smallholder farmer finance field? And as we started talking through it with him, there was a recognition that the field was just not getting to, and the organizations with it were just not getting to a scale that was meaningful with the gap in smallholder farmer finance. I think we did an estimate in 2012 that the need was around 450 billion, and the current lenders were providing about 20 billion. So, even at 10 or 20% growth per year, which would be remarkable, you just don't get to a meaningful size too quickly. So with that, we started a conversation and tried to think through, are there mechanisms where you could take this beyond a single organization, where you could truly think about a market building mechanism? And what came out of that was we actually, in this case, did hire Dahlberg to go back and actually go through everyone's lending portfolio and take a look at, frankly, what was working and what wasn't working. What type of returns did they have? What were the costs? What were the risks they were looking at? And in a way, we're able to map out the whole field and say, hey, here's what's commercial and here's what's not commercial. And the idea that came out of that is, could we create a bit of an impact frontier and subsidize work to move the commercial investment down into this sort of non-commercial sector? And Aceli Africa was born out of those discussions. And what we did is we then hired Brian into GDI. We wrapped a team around him, because that's sort of our model, which included a bunch of strategists, a finance and operations team, a branding marketing team, a talent and HR team to help them hire what eventually is now about a dozen people in East Africa, build out the partnerships and help with the funding. And, in some respects, it's one of our best examples, both I think in terms of the type of work, what we want to do, but also how we do the work. So on the what we want to do, it's dramatically scaled. It's underwriting and supporting one loan per day on average in East Africa, with a collection of 20 to 30 local banks. And those are mostly loans that would not have happened to SMEs that support smallholder farmers. So potentially, game changing in terms of catalyzing a market there. And then in terms of how we work, we have been able to stand up this organization in about a year and a half from 0 to 12 to 15 people, $40 to $50 million of funding with about a half dozen anchor funders, and help them refine this really tricky model to put in the marketplace. And the last thing I'd say is, what's exciting to me about this, and from a public good perspective, we think this idea, which people don't like to call it this, but I'll just call it directly, a smart subsidy model that's really smart, efficient, meets the market where it is, doesn't over incentivize, but sort of brings up the whole field. We think it can be applied in off-grid energy. We think it can be provided in water and sanitation, and a bunch of fields that have this public and private mix.
Yeah, no, and we used to talk at Acumen Fund, which was a philanthropic impact investor, about the gap between negative 100% returns of pure grant-based models and the 25 or 30% returns. And so there are ways to find those things which can deliver recovery of cost of capital or need a 3 or 4% subsidy to do so. The leverage of the limited amount of public and or philanthropic capital to drive real impact is potentially enormous. You were also behind the evolution of Convergence. And as we talk about the kind of smart subsidy and the need for creative capital solutions and for market rate capital to coexist with development finance capital to coexist with philanthropy, tell us about what Convergence is doing and how that kind of came about through your work.
Yeah. So Convergence is an online platform for blended finance transactions. They provide grant funding to help design new products. They help blueprint different structures, and then they help syndicate the deals. So bringing together public and private capital is often not easy. There's search costs, there's structuring challenges, there's design costs, and Convergence tries to solve those. Blended finance has been around. I think probably you could say in the CDFI space in the US, it's been around for 50, 60, 70 years. But in the global development space, there had been things like green-backed bonds and CDOs, collateralized debt obligation structures for microfinance, but very few sort of beyond a couple areas that have been proven out. And we wrote a report in 2014 that said, what would it take to really scale blended finance? And 3 recommendations came out of it. One was the design costs are too high. If you're going to do a $10 million bond and it costs $3 million to just design and structure it, it just doesn't make sense. But if you believe that $10 million bond can be replicated or scaled to 100 million or 50, $10 million bonds, it becomes interesting. So somebody described that to us as the how do you get the first olive out of the olive jar problem. Mm-hmm. The second one was the structuring challenge. And part of it is these deals are, sometimes clever, sometimes not, but they're a bit of a black box and people don't know what the structures look like. On the other side, whether somebody at Citibank said to us, I have no shortage of people who can structure anything in the world. I got about 10,000 of them, but we just need some blueprints that we can use to bring into the field. So that was the second recommendation, how to structure. And then the third was what somebody described as the airplane problem, which is this market or nascent market is so opaque that people were hopping on a plane, flying to, talk to the UK government and say, here's what we'd like to propose in this capital stack of public and private capital. And in the first 5 minutes, they say, well, we don't play in that type of structure. And they hop back on the airplane and go home. So is there a way to more efficiently connect and syndicate some of the investors? So that's been the idea behind it. We took it from this report, credit to a great entrepreneur in the government of Canada named Tom Bowie, who picked up this report and said, this is what the government of Canada needs to lead, and got their foreign minister behind it, and gave us a large grant to basically design and build this, get it regulated or non-registered in a variety of jurisdictions. We built the tech platform, the legal structure. I served as the interim CEO. We pulled in the board. We hired a recruiting firm to take me out and build the team under. And now, it continues to grow significantly. I think there's still some other challenges in the market that need to be addressed in terms of facilitating specific deals and getting those structured. But in terms of the platform, it's achieving what it set out to do.
Yep. And just looking at the clock, I want to turn it to folks on the call in a couple minutes with maybe one or two more questions from me. So if you've got questions, please feel free to chat them, or we can pull you off of mute if you want to raise your hand. After a year and a half of Zoom teaching, we're adept at keeping an eye on the chat as well as the Zoom hand. So be ready for that. But what are some of the lessons that you've learned about? I mean, it sounds like you kind of play a little bit of this incubator and support for field catalysts, but as we've again shifted the unit of analysis from scaling the solution to solving the problem at scale, what does it take? What are the attributes of good field catalysts? We have in our mind what it takes to be a good entrepreneur, innovative, iconoclastic, ambitious, persistent, good team builder, et cetera. But what are the characteristics of a good field catalyst, and how have you observed those who've been effective at really trying to change the system gone about doing it?
Yeah. So I'd say first up front, that what anchors our thinking and being a field catalyst is this idea of, and probably don't need to add another word or set of words into the lexicon in this field, but we think of it a little as results-driven systems change. And for us, what that means is on one hand, we think you do need to drive as an organization or a set of organizations field very specific results. You have to show what's possible and achieve a level of proof points. We also think it's important from any advocacy or constituency basis to build up constituents, set of stakeholders that can then advocate for change. So there has to be some level of implementation and showing very tangible results that should have an evidence base behind it. On the other hand, we also subscribe to the belief that you need a broader systems change agenda, and you need to be thinking about incentives, policy, and some level of who you are trying to influence to both ultimately do the work you're trying to do at scale and pay for it. Mm-hmm. So that marriage is how we drive most of our efforts. We're always trying to push, whether it's an individual organization or a multi-stakeholder initiative. How do you show that this is doable? And once it's doable, who do you influence? So to make it tangible around the Aceli Africa, the real play with that at scale is not to take the $40 or $50 million we've raised from donors to build this market. It's sort of twofold. It's a mixed market. We want to have the commercial sector move down and into as many new places as it can in the market, new crops, new geographies, smaller deals, and innovate there. But we're also mindful, the US, Germany, South Korea, we all subsidize our smallholder farmer market. And we think there is a role to sustain a certain segment of the market. And part of what we're trying to do with Aceli, and we've started already, is have the discussions with the central bank, the ministries of finance, the ministries of agriculture in each of these countries in East Africa to take over this model from us and make it part of their own policy and finance programs in the country. So that's really what orients us. And I think to do that, you need to be, at some level, a bit of a neutral broker. Organizations that bring an ideology that's too strong or too activist sometimes, I think, don't make those partnerships or coalitions function as well.
Yep.
I'll leave it there. But that's sort of what anchors our thinking of what a good field building catalyst can do.
Yeah, and presumably is the platform that GDI provides. Root Capital may not have been able to do this itself because it is a player in the ecosystem. So Brian Milder had to step out. Jordan Cassellow with the iLions, which you helped broker, stepped out of Vision Spring. So I get that. So as Sarah has put in the chat, we are open for your questions. I don't see any yet, so I will keep going with questions. They'll get tougher and tougher until we break, Andrew. But do keep thinking of questions now and/or raise your hand. What do you? A critique that you start to hear about results-driven systems change. And there was a great piece in the Stanford Social Innovation Review by Kevin Starr at the Malago Foundation. Is this old wine in new bottles? Is this just impact investing was the new term for venture philanthropy, which was a way of capitalizing social entrepreneurship, which is an enduring concept that has actually predated the term itself, which was sort of coined a little bit at Harvard Business School. So how do you convince the skeptics that this is really a new phenomenon at play?
Yeah, I'm not one of these people that thinks everything's new. I think, like I said, these ideas have been around. I don't know, you probably go back to venture philanthropy in biblical times or something. But I think the challenge is then how do you take what may be some bright spots, either historically or even in the field, and shift things, right? So that it becomes the pervasive way that people do business in a field, right? So, even though we're saying, okay, systems change has been around, if you go out to most funders, whether it's a government agency or a philanthropy, 95% of what they do is not trying to drive systems. They're still beholden to this very narrow, immediate, show me your results in the next, 4 months. And again, there's some merit in that. And certainly in some fields and sectors, that's exactly what you want to be doing, a vaccination campaign as an example. But they have not shifted to the opening up a little bit more around how do we think of the longer term? How do we think of sustainability? How do we think about these shifts? So I do think that, whether it's the discourse, whether it's people trying to show it's possible, whether it's people working with the organizations, all these things have to happen if we believe this is where the fundamental changes happen in society.
Yeah. Well, we've got Kareem with hand up. So Kareem, if you want to come off mute and ask Andrew your question, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Andrew. This is really inspiring. And after I finish this Zoom, I will read more about the work you have done because it sounds very interesting to me. One of the criticisms to global development effort is that sometimes they are not really considered to the specific context of countries they are operating in, like the cultural, social, political context. So my question is, what's your approach in order to engage positively with the context and understand it more and make sure that your efforts is in line with what can work in the specific country you're in? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah, great question. So a couple ways we think about this. So almost every effort we lead, it falls into one of two buckets. One is it's either we are trying to support a local leader in a community that we think can scale their program. So we find, as an example, we are running now a group run by a Dalit organization in India called Jan Sahas that is trying to reach 10 million internal migrants in the construction industry. And a really interesting model with, again, results-driven systems change. It's trying to reach 10 million, but more importantly, it's trying to shift the social protection programs in India and create an ethical recruiting in the construction industry. But our team found the leader of this, Ashif, and recognized him as a great leader and somebody who does understand the local context and somebody who we could wrap around the type of support we could bring to elevate this, not just in India, but maybe in other markets as well. So that's one approach. Another one is we often run some big global efforts. So an example may be our effort focused on unlocking mental health services around the world called Cities Rise. And in that one, we're working in about 10 cities around the world. But in each of those cities, we've gone through a pretty rigorous, robust process to find the local leaders, find the local stakeholders, and basically give them the resources and ideas to bubble up opportunities. And then we provide sort of the partnerships, the funding, some of the global experts that can support them. Really interesting and exciting about that example is because nobody's figured out mental health, whether it's in the US, Europe, or Nairobi or Chennai, the cities we're working with are actually all collaborating really closely, and Seattle and Sacramento, which are part of the first 10, are drawing as many ideas from Nairobi, Bogota, and Chennai. So it's a good example of some of the cross-pollination. But at the core of it, we're basically just trying to find really smart local leaders and give them a little support and strength to push their idea forward.
Yeah, and I mean, I think while there is still kind of philanthropy and development capital in the United States and Europe, I think challenge is how to channel those resources in a smart and effective way that is inclusive. And I do think that the ethos of a lot of the work that I've observed of GDI has been to create a much more level playing field and inviting in Indigenous leaders to step up and support them in that process. So thanks for the question. And I see an old-fashioned hand raised, not a technical hand raised. So Sudhir, please come off mute, and if you can do that and ask your question. And then there's a comment or two in the chat.
Hi. Sorry about the old-fashioned thing. I was just looking around for the way to raise my hand and couldn't find it. So very interesting question. I really love it. My background is from systems design, strategic systems design. So my question comes at this, my question to you comes from my own practice, right? My practice basically says that a lot of us, and this is somewhat similar to what Karim had asked earlier, which is understanding the context better, right? And my experience basically, and it's not very significant in development, it's mostly been as a volunteer, been doing things in India. I'm right now in Boston. My experience basically has been that, our understanding that we bring from the outside is usually faulty, right? That it takes a significant amount of time to actually figure out what it is that is happening and what needs to happen. So these, so I wonder whether this kind of a model, when you, for example, said something about, scaling something to 10 million construction industry people, I wonder if these are truly systemic, like, or in which, in what way do you consider these as systemic issues? Because I once wrote a proposal for the Gates Foundation in terms of trying to use finance as a means to improve, conditions. And it seems like, the mechanism of using financial incentives or access to financial services alone did not seem to truly understand the diverse, needs within various communities across the country that, you needed to figure out. And you really needed a very different way of figuring out what is working where and, how to channel your resources and energy. So somewhat like that. I hope I was clear enough.
Yeah, I think so. And apologies, I switched rooms. I'm hoping the connection's a little better here. It's been a little choppy for me, but Sudhir, I think I got most of what you were saying there. If I understand, there's sort of two parts to what you're saying. There's one of how do you sort of create the local, make sure things are appropriate in the local context when you're thinking of broader systems change. And then second, how does the financing play into that? Maybe on the first part, at risk of sort of going back to my previous answer, to me, it really does come back down to the leader and the entrepreneur. And one of the reasons, to me, where do you start first in the classic chicken and egg of do you drive results or systems change first? I always think you start with the results, because if you have a really good entrepreneur, he or she is going to be able to, sort of have their hand on the stove and adapt things and learn things. And, the Esteli Africa one is a great example. I've talked with Brian, the entrepreneur behind it, over the last few days, and certain parts of it are not working. Even though we're underwriting a loan a day, there's certain parts that are just don't fit the market well enough. And he and his team are smart enough to shift that, to quickly change things, to try something new. So there's an element of the entrepreneur adapting things. And I would say on the financing, and maybe Brian has a perspective on this as well, there has been more of a push, I think, to this outcomes-based financing or pay for results. And I think in as much as there is some, at some risk, universality around, I don't know, creating a metric around job creation or sustained jobs, it then does allow that local adaptation underneath. If it's constricted to, we're going to give you this money to make, 100 jobs in this field, that's when things start to struggle, right? But if it's more in the out, we need to create 1,000 jobs in a geography, here's the incentive for that. I think it does allow that adaptability to the system around it without creating too many constrictors.
Yeah, and we talk a little bit about how product market fit is the king in kind of traditional entrepreneurship, and you really can't get anywhere unless you've got that. But what we observe a lot in philanthropy or global development is founder-funder fit, which is somebody comes with a compelling idea that is able to raise a lot of money from the Gates Foundation. And I think what's important in the example and the metaphor that Andrew used of the hand on the hot stove, you have to have both. Because if you end up with just founder-funder fit, you'll intervene with a solution that works for the donors, but may not work for the beneficiaries. And so bridging that gap between founder-funder fit and product market fit, I think is kind of a core essence of what I've observed Andrew and his team at GDI doing. Our host has a question. So Sarah, please come in.
Great, thank you. And so, Andrew, I'm interested also how COVID has affected the work of GDI. And are there any lessons that your organization or you have learned during COVID that we can use as pivot points for development for creating maybe better systems going forward?
Yeah. Other than something Brian and I have joked about recently of needing reading glasses and staring at screens for most of our life. A couple things. One, I do think COVID has opened up some opportunities for innovation in new fields, and we have been trying to both support and fund efforts that, some of these shifts, either creating a window of opportunity or more permanent changes. Two that come to mind more in the domestic market are, remote education, remote learning, or tutoring for students that are falling behind. I think there's just tremendous opportunities there, and we've supported some efforts that is COVID driven that I think will be permanent in terms of the interventions. There's other things where I think there's more windows of opportunity, prison reform, de-incarceration. There's whether it's, pressures on state budgets, whether it was about humanitarian concerns around COVID. There's a window that we've seen opening with a lot of activity for reform there. And then on our side, in terms of the work, obviously around the health systems, we have launched an effort called Leapfrog to Value, where we're trying to take what has been in sort of the US, especially a volume game of healthcare. The whole system is structured around number of hospital beds and inputs, and trying to make sure the next set of countries building up, whether it's Kenya or South Africa or India or elsewhere, are not replicating that model and going in what we would think of as more value-based healthcare with a greater focus on social determinants, with a greater focus on prevention and promotion of healthy behaviors. And as we've seen with, vaccine skepticism, a greater level of trust and human interaction between the medical community or more broadly, the public health system and patients and citizens. So for us, that's a big focus of what we're looking at right now. I think it'll pervade into some of the other work, whether it's, around the intersection of climate and health or people on the move, migrants and health. So that I'd say is probably one of the biggest sort of COVID influences on the work we're doing.
And back to me, since there are no hands up and or in the chat, I guess a question that might be relevant to the students who are on the Zoom. What do you wish you had learned in graduate school, or what would you recommend that students today in school learn or unlearn in order to be more effective at this results-driven systems change that you talk about?
Yeah, well, one is more of a prosaic. I think the Kennedy School does a good job of it. I think the business school could do a better job, although I heard they used to do this years ago. The 2-page memo, I gotta say, like the number of 2-page memos I've written in the last 15 years since graduate school, I feel like I probably write 2 or 3 a week. And the Kennedy School does, I feel like some of the classes are all about the 2-page memo. I understand the business school used to have to drop off a 2-page memo every Saturday morning or something. I don't think that happens anymore. But that's more of the prosaic thing. One of them is, and maybe I'll center this more at the Kennedy School. I've been thinking, I've had some conversations with a lot of think tanks and academic institutions recently. And I do think this element of how do you take good thinking and good policy into practice is something that, I feel like there's public management. I feel like there's great policy making, and the link between the two is not as strong as it should be. Our little tagline at GDI is turning good ideas into great solutions. And I'd say some of that is learned of like, how do you advocate? How do you sell? How do you implement and structure a program? How do you be entrepreneurial, right? How do you marshal resources that don't exist? And then the other 90% is just frankly chutzpah, to be the person who's going to step in there and take the risk and pick up the ball that may be in the middle of the field that nobody else wants to pick up. So I don't know if that's a straight on answer, but that's like when I think of like since graduate school, there's like the prosaic, just the 2-page memo, but then there's just an orientation. How do you orient people and get them comfortable with some level of uncertainty and self-initiated action, even when it may be wrong, it may go in the wrong direction. I'm not sure how much of that is a skill set as opposed to maybe a temperament.
Yeah. Well, maybe a final question from Ilana here in the chat, and I'll kind of paraphrase it a little bit. You touched on it a bit, but what advice do you have to aspiring systems change entrepreneurs to get started to sort of understand the plausibility of really shifting a whole complex system when the solution isn't fully tested? They may not have it come into full focus. In my course, I like to think that social entrepreneurs are kind of intuitive systems thinkers, but you have to kind of get in the game to really fully understand the system that you're confronting. So what advice would you give to early stage systems change entrepreneurs after they've left school and are really trying to enter the game? What is important for them to do in their early days?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say join one of these leading organizations, I'm not saying from GDI side, but these organizations out in the field that are trying to do that and test the ideas. And I do wonder, there may be, as you're interviewing for jobs, that may be a question back to the entrepreneur, right? Or the head of the organization, which is, how do they think beyond what their own organization is delivering? They are going to be shifting the field they're in. And, Brian, you and I know well, he's probably a few miles from this location in Cambridge. Somebody like Willie Foote is thinking about that every day. And you ask Willie and he will give you both, here's the lending portfolio and what I need to see every quarter. And here's why I'm not satisfied and need to think much, much bigger about how do you change the field? How do you get others to replicate what I'm doing? How do you change the policies or local banks and all of that? So I would say, you find the right organizations and you find the right people and start working with them. Yeah.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you, Andrew, for the time and your thoughts. I'll turn it back to Sarah just to kind of close out and share some coming events, but appreciate your time, Andrew, and all of your participation in this Zoom.
Great. Thank you both so much for such an interesting discussion. And we look forward to seeing more of the work that GDI does. And so, Andrew, please keep us in the loop. And everyone on the call, we hope that you will join us for our events, as I mentioned, on October 27th on building resilient education systems. And that's a panel event which will be moderated by CID Director Asim Khwaja. And then we also hope that you'll join us for our next speaker series on Friday, October 9th with Latanya Mapp-Fret, the President and CEO of the Global Fund for Women. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.